Welcome back to Blurr. In part 1, we followed Albert Einstein's journey from a curious child and struggling student to the brilliant patent clerk who revolutionized physics. Now, in part 2, we'll explore the years that transformed Einstein into the most famous scientist on Earth, from the 1919 solar eclipse that confirmed his theories to worldwide fame, political controversy, personal struggles, and his lasting impact on humanity. This is the story of the man behind the legend. If you enjoy this audiobook, please like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's continue the remarkable story of Albert Einstein. The turning point, 1919. A solar eclipse makes him famous, if 1905 represented the intellectual turning point of Einstein's career. The moment his genius first revealed itself on paper, 1919, represented the turning point in his public recognition. The moment Einstein transformed from a respected figure within the relatively small world of theoretical physics into the most famous scientist on the planet, a global celebrity whose name would become permanently synonymous with genius itself. Einstein had spent the years between 1908 and 1915 working with his former classmate Marcel Grossmann and drawing on conversations with various colleagues, developing an extension of his original 1905 special theory of relativity into a far more ambitious and mathematically complex general theory of relativity, published in its complete form in 1915. This new theory proposed something genuinely radical: that gravity itself was not a conventional force acting at a distance, as Newton had described it for over 2 centuries, but rather a curvature of space and time itself, caused by the presence of mass and energy. One striking, testable prediction of this theory was that light from distant stars should be measurably bent as it passed near a massive object like the sun, a deflection too small to observe under normal conditions, but potentially detectable during a total solar eclipse, when the sun's overwhelming brightness was temporarily blocked, allowing positions of nearby stars to be precisely measured. In May 1919, British astronomer Arthur Eddington led 2 separate scientific expeditions, one to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa, another to Sobral, Brazil, specifically to observe a total solar eclipse and measure exactly this predicted gravitational light-bending effect. The observations, when carefully analyzed and announced later that year, confirmed Einstein's prediction with remarkable precision. Announcement made global front-page news in a way that no scientific discovery, before or arguably since, had ever achieved. Newspapers around the world ran dramatic headlines proclaiming the overturning of 2 centuries of Newtonian physics and the emergence of an entirely new conception of the universe, and at the center of every headline was a single name: Albert Einstein. Almost overnight, a respected but relatively obscure to the general public theoretical physicist became one of the most famous human beings on Earth. His name, and even his physical appearance, the wild hair, the expressive eyes, the increasingly recognizable mustache, becoming globally iconic in a manner previously reserved for political leaders, religious figures, or popular entertainers, not theoretical physicists working through abstract mathematics, a fame that carried real danger. This sudden, extraordinary global celebrity arrived at a particularly fraught moment in German history, and it would soon expose Einstein to genuine, serious personal danger as the nascent Nazi movement began gaining political traction in Germany throughout the 1920s. Einstein's prominent identity as a Jewish scientist whose revolutionary theories had displaced foundational principles of classical, and implicitly, in the increasingly nationalist German imagination, German physics made him a specific and frequent target. The rising Nazi Party began publicly denouncing relativity theory itself as a Jewish perversion, using attacks on Einstein's scientific work as a vehicle for broader anti-Semitic political messaging. Einstein received so many serious anonymous death threats during this period that he reportedly began avoiding walking alone in public, far from silencing him. However, this hostility appears to have strengthened his resolve to use his now considerable global platform to speak out publicly against the political forces he saw gathering momentum around him. "Silence in the face of evil," he later explained, "would have made me feel guilty of complicity." When Adolf Hitler formally came to power as Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, Einstein happened to be visiting the United States. He never returned to Germany. He formally renounced his German citizenship for a second time and accepted a position at the newly established Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, beginning the final and longest chapter of his life as a permanent exile from the country of his birth, in the country that would eventually grant him citizenship in 1940, even as he chose to retain his Swiss citizenship simultaneously for the remainder of his life. Rise to power, becoming a global moral authority, not just a scientific one. Einstein's rise to power, in the conventional sense used elsewhere in this biography series, looked nothing like the corporate empires, political offices, or commercial fortunes built by other figures profiled in this collection. Einstein never saw it and explicitly declined when it was directly offered to him any form of conventional, institutional, or political power. In a remarkable historical episode in 1952, following the death of Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion formally offered Einstein, a prominent, longtime supporter of the Zionist movement, though one who maintained significant reservations about Jewish nationalism in its more militant forms, the largely ceremonial but symbolically enormous position of President of Israel. Einstein, after careful consideration, respectfully declined, citing both his advancing age and his own self-assessment that he lacked the natural aptitude and temperament for the diplomatic and interpersonal demands of formal political leadership, regardless of how ceremonial the specific role might be. Instead, Einstein's actual rise to influence took an entirely different and, in its own way, unprecedented form. He became, over the final decades of his life, perhaps the single most globally recognized and trusted moral and intellectual authority of his era, a figure whose public statements on war, peace, civil rights, nuclear weapons, and political freedom carried genuine weight and attention precisely because they came from a person whose scientific genius was beyond serious public dispute and who had no evident personal political ambition to gain from the positions he took, a voice against nationalism, racism, and nuclear escalation. Throughout his decades in America, Einstein used his enormous platform consistently and repeatedly to advocate for causes that frequently put him at odds with prevailing American political and social attitudes of the era. He was an outspoken and explicit critic of militant nationalism, once memorably describing it as the measles of mankind. He was a consistent critic of unchecked capitalism's social consequences, writing in a notable 1949 essay titled "Why Socialism?" that he regarded entrenched class differences as fundamentally contrary to justice. Most strikingly, given the deeply entrenched racial attitudes of mid-20th century America, Einstein became an outspoken and active advocate for African American civil rights at a time when this stance carried genuine social and political risk, even for a man of his international stature. In 1937, after the celebrated African-American opera singer Marian Anderson was denied a hotel room in Einstein's adopted hometown of Princeton, New Jersey, due to her race, Einstein personally invited her to stay at his own home, the beginning of a lasting personal friendship. He developed a similarly close friendship with the prominent black actor, singer, and civil rights activist Paul Robeson, with whom he co-chaired the American Crusade to end lynching. In a 1946 commencement address delivered at the historically black Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, Einstein delivered a blunt, unambiguous condemnation. Segregation, he declared, is a disease of white people, opposing the hydrogen bomb and McCarthyism. As the Cold War deepened through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, Einstein became an increasingly vocal advocate for international control of atomic weapons and a vocal critic of the escalating nuclear arms race, opposing the development of the even more powerful hydrogen bomb and consistently calling for global cooperative frameworks to prevent nuclear catastrophe. He also became one of the most prominent and outspoken critics of the anti-communist political hysteria associated with Senator Joseph McCarthy during the early 1950s, a period during which Einstein publicly described McCarthy's investigative tactics as methods that used people as tools for the prosecution of others that one wants to label as unorthodox, and which he considered a genuine, serious danger to American intellectual and academic freedom. Publicly defended J.G. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, after Oppenheimer was controversially stripped of his security clearance over suspected leftist political associations. Witness in the legal defense of the elderly civil rights pioneer, Boy Dubois, who had been accused by the Justice Department of acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government. A case that was dismissed shortly after Einstein's involvement became public. He also publicly appealed for clemency for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, the couple ultimately executed for conspiracy to commit espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union, enemies and controversies. A 427-page FBI file. Einstein's consistent public advocacy on behalf of pacifism, civil rights, socialism, and international cooperation made him a subject of sustained, serious official suspicion within the American government, most significantly from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who began compiling a secret dossier on Einstein as early as December 1932, shortly after Einstein first arrived in the United States. By the time of Einstein's death in April 1955, this FBI file had grown to an extraordinary 427 pages, reflecting Hoover's deep and sustained personal suspicion that Einstein was, in Hoover's own characterization, quite possibly a communist, and certainly an extreme radical. Hoover's suspicion of Einstein extended to active attempt to limit his presence and influence in the United States. Declassified records confirm that Hoover went so far as to recommend that Einstein be formally barred from entering the United States under the Alien Exclusion Act when Einstein first sought to immigrate in the 1930s, a recommendation that was ultimately overruled by the U.S. State Department, allowing Einstein's immigration to proceed. The same underlying suspicion about Einstein's political reliability was the formally documented reason he was denied security clearance to participate directly in the Manhattan Project he had helped initiate. Tension with religious and political orthodoxy. Einstein's relationship to organized religion and conventional political ideology was, throughout his life, genuinely complex and frequently misunderstood by partisans on multiple sides, eager to claim him for their own cause. He explicitly rejected the label of atheist, articulating instead a more pantheistic conception of cosmic order, famously invoking the philosophy of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, and stating in various contexts that he believed in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the lawful harmony of all that exists, rather than a personal God concerned with human affairs and morality. This nuanced position satisfied neither strict religious believers, who considered it insufficiently devout, nor committed secular atheists, who considered it an unnecessary philosophical hedge. Similarly, while Einstein's documented socialist sympathies and consistent criticism of unchecked capitalism made him a target of suspicion from American conservatives and government security officials, his independent, often unpredictable, intellectual positions, including his explicit and sustained criticisms of authoritarian Soviet communism alongside his criticisms of Western capitalism, meant he never comfortably fit into the simple ideological categories that both his admirers and his detractors frequently sought to impose upon him. The personal cost of a complicated marriage. Einstein's personal and family life carries its own significant complications that responsible biography requires acknowledging. His marriage to Mileva Maric, the brilliant fellow physics student he had once loved deeply enough to defy his own family's objections, deteriorated substantially over the following decade, with Einstein later attributing the growing estrangement in his own characterization to what he perceived as Maric's increasing taciturnity, jealousy, and depressive tendencies. Though it is worth noting this characterization comes entirely from Einstein's own later account, and Maric, whose own substantially so mathematical and scientific capabilities were never given the same opportunity to flourish independently, left a far more limited historical record of her own perspective on the marriage's breakdown. By 1912, Einstein had begun a romantic relationship with his cousin, Elsa Leventhal, a divorced woman living in Berlin, while still legally married to Maric. Einstein and Maric eventually divorced in 1919, and Einstein married Elsa later that same year. The episode reveals a genuine and significant gap between Einstein's publicly celebrated moral and intellectual stature on matters of global justice, and his more privately complicated, and by some assessments genuinely painful, personal conduct within his own first marriage, family relationships, a reminder that even history's most celebrated minds are not free from the ordinary human complications and moral inconsistencies that affect personal relationships, psychology, and mindset. Thought experiments over equations. Einstein's single most distinctive intellectual characteristic, repeatedly emphasized in his own later writings and reflections on his own working methods, was his profound reliance on what he termed thought experiments. Vivid, carefully constructed mental scenarios used to explore the logical consequences of physical principles, often preceding and guiding the more formal mathematical work required to fully develop a theory, rather than the reverse. His original insight into special relativity, by his own account, emerged years earlier, around age 16, from a specific thought experiment, imagining what it would actually look like to travel alongside a beam of light at the speed of light itself, and recognizing the deeply strange, logically paradoxical implications this scenario seemed to produce under classical Newtonian physics. This capacity for vivid, physically intuitive, imaginative reasoning, visualizing the actual physical experience of extreme, otherwise inaccessible scenarios, and then rigorously working out their logical implications, distinguished Einstein's particular cognitive approach from many of his more purely mathematically oriented contemporaries. A deep, lifelong suspicion of authority, a consistent thread running through Einstein's entire life, from his adolescent rebellion against the rigid German gymnasium system, through his lifelong opposition to militarism, nationalism, and political authoritarianism of every variety, was a deep and remarkably consistent temperamental suspicion of unquestioned institutional authority. He distrusted rigid systems that demanded conformity and discouraged independent questioning, whether those systems took the form of an authoritarian school, a nationalist government, an oppressive racial hierarchy, or a politically motivated investigative committee. This temperamental disposition helps explain both his early academic struggles, his documented friction with several of his polytechnic professors, whose authority he was reluctant to simply defer to without genuine intellectual justification, and his later, more consequential public activism, his willingness to publicly criticize McCarthyism, American racial segregation, and nuclear weapons proliferation, even when doing so generated serious personal and professional risk, including sustained FBI surveillance, a genuine, sustained sense of cosmic wonder. Beyond his specific scientific and political positions, Einstein consistently articulated, across decades of public statements, private correspondence, and published essays, a deeply felt sense of awe and wonder at the fundamental order and wonder, comprehensibility of the physical universe, an emotional and even spiritual orientation toward his scientific work that he considered inseparable from genuine scientific motivation itself. He repeatedly expressed the view that the capacity for wonder, curiosity, and a kind of reverent humility before the mysteries of existence represented the essential emotional foundation of all genuine scientific inquiry, a perspective considerably more expansive and humanistic than the popular caricature of cold, purely rationalistic scientific genius that his public image sometimes suggested. Quotes that define the man. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world. Try not to become a man of success, but rather try to become a man of value. Peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved by understanding. The important thing is not to stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing. I have no special talent. I'm only passionately curious. That final quote, strikingly, almost defiantly modest given the source, captures something genuinely central to how Einstein understood his own remarkable career. Not as the product of some innate, exceptional cognitive gift, setting him apart from ordinary humanity, but as the result of a sustained, disciplined willingness to keep questioning, keep wondering, and keep imagining possibilities that conventional authority and conventional thinking had simply never bothered to seriously consider. Legacy and lessons. What he actually built. Einstein's scientific legacy is, by any reasonable measure, among the most consequential in the entire history of the entire history. Human knowledge. His special and general theories of relativity fundamentally transformed humanity's basic understanding of space, time, gravity, and the large-scale structure of the universe, providing, among countless other practical and theoretical consequences, the essential theoretical foundation underlying modern GPS satellite technology, which must continuously correct for the relativistic time effects Einstein first described, in order to maintain the precision accuracy that billions of people rely on every single day, almost entirely without awareness of the underlying physics making it possible. As Einstein himself, somewhat ironically, remained a persistent and famous skeptic of certain core philosophical implications of the fully developed quantum theory that his own early work had helped establish, his famous, oft-repeated objection that God does not play dice with the universe, reflecting his deep discomfort with quantum mechanics' fundamentally probabilistic description of physical reality, his mass-energy equivalence equation, each E Mach die, while representing only a small o mathematical component of his much larger body of theoretical work, became, through its direct connection to the practical reality of nuclear fission and the atomic bomb, perhaps the single most historically consequential equation ever derived by any scientist in human history. What he revealed about the relationship between genius and conscience, beyond his purely scientific contributions, Einstein's broader life and public career stand as one of history's most significant demonstrations of a principle that remains genuinely difficult and contested, that exceptional intellectual achievement carries with it, at minimum, a strong moral invitation, though never an absolute guarantee, toward exceptional moral and civic engagement. As well, Einstein did not have to use his scientific celebrity to speak out against Nazism, American racial segregation, McCarthyist political persecution, or nuclear weapons proliferation. He chose to do so repeatedly and at real personal cost, including sustained surveillance by his own adopted government, because he held a genuine, consistently articulated conviction that scientific genius, which remained silent in the face of grave injustice, represented a form of moral complicity he found personally unacceptable. At the same time, Einstein's own unresolved anguish over the atomic bomb, a weapon whose development he had inadvertently helped set in motion through a single, reluctantly signed letter based on the best available information at a moment of genuine existential dread about Nazi nuclear ambitions, illustrates the profound, sometimes tragic limits of even the most well-intentioned moral reasoning when applied to genuinely unprecedented technological and historical circumstances. Einstein could not have reliably known, in the summer of 1939, that the German nuclear program would ultimately fail due to factors he had no way of anticipating. His decision, made in good faith under conditions of severe uncertainty, nonetheless produced consequences he spent the remainder of his life unable to fully reconcile with his deepest pacifist convictions. 3 lessons that matter. Lesson 1. Institutional rejection is not necessarily a reliable verdict on genuine intellectual merit. Einstein's repeated early rejections, a failed university entrance exam, nearly 2 years of fruitless applications for academic teaching positions, persistent friction with several of his own professors, occurred not because his underlying scientific talent was actually deficient, but because the specific evaluative criteria and institutional gatekeeping mechanisms of his era were poorly designed to recognize his particular, unconventional combination of independent-mindedness and theoretical brilliance. His most important scientific work emerged not despite this institutional rejection, but in a position, the patent office, that, almost by accident, provided him the stable income and genuine intellectual freedom that a conventional academic appointment, with its attendant departmental politics and teaching obligations, might well have constrained. Lesson 2. Sustained, disciplined curiosity, pursued consistently, over time, can produce results that raw intelligence alone does not guarantee. Einstein's own repeated, explicit insistence that his achievements stemmed from passionate curiosity, rather than some unique innate talent, deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as false modesty. His capacity to keep questioning fundamental assumptions that virtually every other physicist of his era had simply taken for granted, the absolute, fixed nature of space and time required not just raw cognitive horsepower, but a specific, sustained psychological disposition, a willingness to keep asking, but why must this be true? Long after most capable minds would have stopped questioning and simply accepted the conventional wisdom of their field. Lesson 3. Moral courage and intellectual achievement are genuinely separate capacities, and possessing one does not automatically confer the other. But cultivating both together represents one of the rarest and most valuable forms of human contribution. Einstein's willingness to use his hard-won scientific celebrity in service of unpopular, personally risky, political and moral positions, defending civil rights at a time of entrenched American segregation, opposing McCarthyism at the height of its political power, advocating for international nuclear arms control against the prevailing Cold War consensus, represents a form of courage genuinely distinct from, even if ultimately connected to, the specific kind of intellectual courage required to challenge centuries of settled physics. Many brilliant scientists throughout history have confined their public engagement strictly to their own technical specialty, avoiding the personal risk and controversy associated with broader civic and moral advocacy. Einstein's example suggests that the rarest and most consequential form of genius may be the combination of both. The intellectual capacity to fundamentally reimagine how the universe works, paired with the moral conviction to speak plainly and consistently about how human beings ought to treat one another. Conclusion. The question revisited. We began with a question: how does a child once feared developmentally delayed, a school dropout who fled his own country to avoid mandatory military conscription, a graduate rejected from every academic position he applied for, become the single most recognizable scientific genius in human history? The answer lies, in significant part, in a specific and rare combination of traits: a temperament so naturally resistant to rigid institutional authority that it repeatedly cost him conventional academic opportunity, paired with an extraordinary, sustained capacity for genuinely independent theoretical imagination, the willingness to seriously ask what it would actually look like to ride alongside a beam of light, and to follow the strange, destabilizing logical consequences of that question wherever they led, regardless of how completely they contradicted 2 centuries of settled physical orthodoxy. That same fierce independence of mind, which produced the most significant reconceptualization of space, time, and energy. The history of science also produced a public figure willing to speak plainly against Nazism, racial segregation, McCarthyist persecution, and nuclear escalation, even at the cost of a 427-page FBI file and decades of official government suspicion. And that same independence, paradoxically, also led him, at a moment of genuine and reasonable existential fear about Nazi nuclear ambitions, to sign a single letter that set in motion the development of the most destructive weapon humanity has ever created, a decision he would spend the remaining decade of his life unable to fully reconcile with the deep, sincere pacifism that had defined nearly everything else about his public and private convictions. He once wrote that imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge is limited, while imagination embraces the entire world. His own life stands as the most vivid possible illustration of exactly what that principle can produce, and of the genuinely unresolvable moral weight that can come bundled with imagination powerful enough to actually fundamentally change the world. A person who never made a mistake, never tried anything new. Albert Einstein. And so we come to the end of Albert Einstein's extraordinary life story. More than a scientist, Einstein became a symbol of curiosity, imagination, and the courage to question accepted truths. His discoveries changed our understanding of the universe, while his ideas about peace, responsibility, and humanity continue to inspire people around the world. Though he passed away in 1955, his legacy remains as powerful as ever. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please support Blurr by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting the notification bell for more biographies and audiobooks. And don't forget to leave a comment. What lesson from Einstein's life inspired you the most? Thank you for listening to Blurr. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.